In the summer of 1942, the German war machine was unstoppable. For 3 long years, Europe had burned under the iron grip of World War II. Cities had fallen like dominoes, entire armies were crushed, and millions of lives had already been lost. But Adolf Hitler had set his eyes on something bigger, something that would decide the fate of the entire war. His next target was the beating heart of Soviet resistance, Stalingrad. Stalingrad was not just another city, it was a symbol. Located on the banks of the Volga River, this industrial city produced tanks, tractors, and weapons, the lifeblood of the Soviet war machine. More than that, it carried the name of their leader, Joseph Stalin. Losing Stalingrad would not only cut vital supply lines, but also strike a massive psychological blow to Soviet morale. But for Hitler, there was more. Taking Stalingrad meant proving that Nazi Germany could conquer the East and destroy communism at its core. By the end of July 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by Friedrich Paulus, advanced toward the city with more than 270,000 men. Their tanks rumbled through the vast steppes, their planes darkened the skies, and their artillery thundered day and night. To many German soldiers, Stalingrad looked like their final victory, the last step before crushing the Soviet Union completely. But what they didn't know was that this city would become their graveyard. Inside Stalingrad, life was already turning into a nightmare. Civilians were digging trenches, soldiers were fortifying buildings, and the air smelled of dust and fear. Soviet commander Vasily Chuikov prepared his defense with a single order: not a single step back. Day after day, German forces moved closer. They believed they would crush the city in weeks, but the Soviets had something far stronger than numbers. They had desperation, determination, and a city they refused to surrender. In late August, the first wave of German bombers arrived. Hundreds of planes flew over the Volga, dropping thousands of bombs. In just 48 hours, the once bustling city of Stalingrad turned into a burning wasteland. Entire blocks were flattened, factories crumbled, homes vanished. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and yet, the Soviets did not run. They stayed. They hid in the ruins. They prepared for a fight that would shock the entire world. The German soldiers entered a city they thought was already dead. But the silence they walked into was not peace. It was a trap. The battle had not truly begun, but the ground was ready. The twisted remains of factories, burned-out houses, collapsed bridges, all of it would soon become part of a massive, brutal battlefield. In the early days of September 1942, German infantry advanced toward the center of the city. Streets became war zones. Buildings turned into fortresses. The front line was no longer measured in kilometers, but in meters. Every corner, every stairway, every ruined wall was defended with blood. Soldiers on both sides quickly realized something terrifying. This was not going to be a normal battle. It would be a slow, merciless slaughter. For the Germans, this was supposed to be another fast and glorious victory. For the Soviets, it was survival. And in this fight, survival meant everything. A German officer would later write in his diary, "We take a house. The Russians take it back. We retake it. They counterattack. This happens every hour. Sometimes we fight for a single room." This was the new reality of Stalingrad. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the city became a living hell. The ruins echoed with gunfire. The smell of smoke and blood hung in the air. Civilians were trapped. Soldiers were exhausted, and the German high command still believed they could break the Soviets. But in the shadows of the ruins, Soviet reinforcements were arriving. Divisions crossed the Volga under constant bombardment, ferrying men, guns, and hope into the dying city. And then, something unexpected began to happen. The German advance started to slow. Their confidence began to fade, and a sense of unease started to spread among the soldiers. They didn't know it yet, but Stalingrad was about to become a nightmare that would haunt them forever. The bloodiest battle in history was about to begin, and once it did, there would be no escape. By early September 1942, the city of Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was rubble, a burning maze of collapsed buildings, broken bridges, and silent ruins. But inside that rubble, a war unlike any other was beginning. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, pushed deep into the city. Their soldiers expected a quick and organized capture. What they found instead was chaos. Soviet defenders had no front line. They were everywhere. Snipers hid in shattered windows. Machine gunners lurked behind broken walls. Soldiers waited silently in basements, emerging only when the enemy passed. Every street became a battlefield. Every building became a fortress. Every meter of ground was paid for in blood. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war. It was a kind of fighting they had never experienced before. Tanks were useless in narrow streets. Airstrikes only created more ruins for the Soviets to hide in. German soldiers advanced house by house, floor by floor, room by room, and every step forward meant stepping into a Soviet trap. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Volga River, reinforcements were pouring in. Soviet High Command, under Joseph Stalin, gave a single order to the defenders: hold the city at any cost, and they did. Young recruits, some barely 18, crossed the river in small boats, often under a hail of bullets. Many drowned or died before even reaching the shore. Those who survived were given a rifle, sometimes shared between two men, and sent straight into the fight. One survivor later recalled, "There was no training, no time. They gave me a gun and pointed toward the smoke. That was Stalingrad." In the heart of the city stood a massive concrete factory complex: the Red October factory, the Barricadi plant, and the tractor factory. These places became the center of brutal combat. German artillery bombarded them day and night, but the Soviets refused to leave. They turned the factories into fortresses and death traps. Inside these ruined buildings, soldiers fought at point-blank range. Grenades exploded in hallways. Knives and bayonets clashed in the darkness. Entire floors changed hands multiple times in a single day. A German officer later wrote, "It was like fighting for every corner of hell. We were ghosts in a burning city." The Volga River, just a few hundred meters away, was both a lifeline and a graveyard. Soviet supply boats crossed it constantly, bringing ammunition, food, and fresh troops. But German artillery watched every movement. Many boats never made it. Still, the Soviets came, hour after hour, day after day. By mid-September, the German army had captured almost 90% of Stalingrad. They raised their flags over the central square. From the outside, it looked like victory, but beneath the ruins, Soviet forces were still there, hiding, waiting, fighting. One of the key defensive points was a 4-story apartment building commanded by Yakov Pavlov, later known as Pavlov's house. A small group of men held this single building for nearly 2 months against endless German attacks. They wired the walls with explosives, turned the windows into machine gun nests, and used underground tunnels to move unseen. The Germans threw everything at them: artillery, tanks, even flamethrowers. But the defenders never fell. Every day in Stalingrad blurred into the next. Soldiers slept in cellars next to the bodies of their comrades. Food was scarce. Water came from melted snow. Ammunition was precious, and yet neither side gave up. The Germans believed they were one final push away from victory. The Soviets believed they were one step away from survival. The front line was so close that soldiers could hear the enemy whisper at night. Some even fought with their bare hands. In the center of this storm, General Vasily Chuikov led the Soviet defense. He moved command posts into the ruins, staying dangerously close to the front. His strategy was simple: hug the enemy. By fighting as close as possible, he prevented the Germans from using airstrikes and heavy artillery. It worked. German aircraft circled above, but couldn't tell friend from foe. Bombing the city meant bombing their own troops. Slowly, the German advance began to lose momentum. Every block they captured came at the cost of hundreds of lives. The soldiers were exhausted, frozen, and hungry. Their supply lines stretched thin, and as autumn faded into the brutal Russian winter, the hunters became the hunted. Snow fell over the ruined city, the Volga froze, and a deadly silence crept across the battlefield. The German army had taken most of Stalingrad, but they had walked into a trap they didn't yet see. On the horizon, the Red Army was preparing something massive, something that would change the war forever. By late October 1942, the German Sixth Army had fought its way deep into the heart of Stalingrad. They controlled almost 90% of the city. Their soldiers believed victory was finally within reach. But what they didn't know was that the city they thought they had conquered was about to become a trap they would never escape. The German army was exhausted. They had been fighting for months in the ruins of a dead city. The Russian winter had begun to arrive, bitterly cold, merciless. Supplies were running low, ammunition was running out, and their soldiers were beginning to break. Still, Hitler refused to let them retreat. In his eyes, Stalingrad was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol. It had to be taken at all costs. But while German eyes were fixed on the city, the Soviets were looking far beyond it. On the open steppes north and south of Stalingrad, Soviet generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky were preparing something massive. They called it Operation Uranus. Their plan was simple and brilliant. Instead of attacking the German army head-on in the city, the Soviets would strike at their flanks, the weak spots guarded by Romanian and Italian divisions. These forces were poorly equipped, undertrained, and frozen in the snow. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the silence of the Russian steppe was broken. More than 1 million Soviet troops surged forward. Thousands of tanks and artillery opened fire. The earth itself seemed to shake. The German soldiers inside Stalingrad heard the distant thunder and thought it was just another artillery barrage. But it was more than that. It was the sound of the trap closing. Within just a few days, Soviet armored divisions smashed through the Axis flanks. Romanian units collapsed. German reinforcements couldn't hold their ground. Soviet forces from the north and south began to encircle the city. By November 23rd, the two Soviet spearheads met at the small town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, more than 250,000 men, was now completely surrounded. They were trapped. Inside the city, chaos erupted. The soldiers who thought victory was close suddenly realized they were now prisoners in the very place they had tried to conquer. Snow fell over burned-out buildings. Supplies were gone. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was low, and the temperature dropped to 30 degrees Celsius. The German high command panicked. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the trapped army could be supplied from the air. But it was a lie. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver even a fraction of what was needed. Still, Hitler refused to let them break out. His order was clear: hold Stalingrad at all costs. The German soldiers obeyed. They dug in among the ruins. But what followed was not a fight for victory anymore. It was a fight for survival. Soviet forces tightened the noose. Day after day, their artillery pounded the city from all sides. Bombardments tore through the frozen ruins. The Volga River, once a lifeline for the Soviets, was now their advantage. The Germans had nowhere to run. Inside the pocket, discipline began to collapse. Starvation set in. Wounded soldiers froze to death in makeshift shelters. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "The cold is everywhere. It creeps into your bones. The dead lie around us. We no longer feel fear. Only emptiness. Frostbite took as many lives as bullets. Men wrapped themselves in rags. Horses were slaughtered for food. Entire units disappeared in the blizzards. But the Soviets didn't rush. They watched. They waited. They starved the enemy slowly. In Moscow, Stalin and his generals celebrated. For the first time, the unstoppable German war machine was not advancing. It was dying. And in the frozen streets of Stalingrad, the hunters had truly become the hunted. German commander Friedrich Paulus begged Hitler for permission to retreat, to save his men. But Hitler refused again. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, hoping he would fight to the last bullet. But Paulus knew the truth. There was no way out. By December, Soviet forces had built an iron ring around the entire city. No food, no fuel, no hope. Desperation filled the German lines. Men whispered about death. Officers burned their maps. The once mighty Sixth Army, proud, disciplined, unstoppable, was now broken. Outside the pocket, Soviet tanks and infantry continued to advance. Operation Uranus had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Stalingrad was no longer just a battle. It was a turning point in history, and the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was no longer an army, it was a shadow. What once marched proudly into Stalingrad as the spearhead of Hitler's invasion now lay broken, frozen, and starving inside a city that had become their tomb. The temperature dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. Ammunition was gone. Medical supplies were gone. Fuel was gone. But the Soviet artillery never stopped. Every night the sky over Stalingrad lit up like hell on earth. Flames tore through the ruins. Men screamed into the darkness. Bodies froze where they fell. More than 250,000 German soldiers had entered Stalingrad. Now, Fewer than half remained alive, and those who were still breathing were no longer fighting for Hitler. They were fighting to stay alive just one more day. Inside cellars and bombed-out factories, German soldiers huddled together for warmth. Their uniforms were in rags. Their faces were hollow. Many had stopped talking altogether. Some wandered the ruins like ghosts, their eyes empty, their hope gone. The Soviets could have crushed the pocket quickly, but they didn't. They waited. They starved them. On January 8, 1943, Soviet commanders sent an ultimatum to Friedrich Paulus: surrender or face total destruction. Paulus took the message to his officers, but Hitler's orders were clear: no surrender, fight to the last man. And so, the slaughter continued. A week later, the Soviets launched their final offensive, Operation Ring. Their artillery roared across the frozen city. Thousands of shells crashed down. Soviet tanks and infantry stormed the last German positions, moving block by block, room by room. The German front lines collapsed like a house of cards. Entire divisions ceased to exist in a single day. In the city center, wounded soldiers lay in makeshift hospitals without morphine, without heat. Doctors used kitchen knives as surgical tools. Amputations were done without anesthesia. Men screamed, and then went silent. The proud Sixth Army, once 22 divisions strong, had been reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler was still giving speeches of victory. He told the German people that Stalingrad would hold. He called Paulus a hero. But in the ruins of the city, there were no heroes left. On January 30th, Hitler made his final desperate move. He promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was clear: you will either fight to the death or end your own life. But Paulus didn't follow the script. He looked at his starving, dying men and made his decision. On the morning of January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of Stalingrad to the Soviets. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last remnants of German resistance in the north collapsed as well. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. More than 90,000 German soldiers marched into captivity. Most of them would never return home. Over 150,000 lay dead in the frozen ruins. On the Soviet side, more than 1 million lives had been lost to defend their city. The city itself was nothing but ashes. No building stood untouched. Stalingrad had become a graveyard of armies and of dreams. When news of the defeat reached Berlin, it was a shockwave that shook the Nazi Empire to its core. For the first time, Hitler's unstoppable war machine had been broken. For the first time, the myth of invincibility was shattered. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the turning point of the entire war. After Stalingrad, the Germans would never fully recover. From this moment on, they were no longer advancing. They were retreating. Step by step, city by city. All the way back to Berlin, one Soviet soldier later wrote, "The snow in Stalingrad was not white. It was red. Red with the blood of a generation." And a German survivor remembered, "We thought we were the conquerors, but in Stalingrad, we met our fate." The Battle of Stalingrad remains the bloodiest battle in human history, a place where two empires collided, and only one walked away. A place where courage, madness, and tragedy became one. The ruins of Stalingrad still whisper their story, of an army trapped, of a nation's unbreakable will, and of a moment that changed the course of history forever. This was Stalingrad,